So welcome. I don't know why, is this thing turned on? Can you hear? Yes, okay. For some reason, sitting here, you can never tell whether it's turned on or not. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Rosalie Genevro, the Executive Director of the Architectural League, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the first of 3 conversations on New York that we're presenting in connection with the League's exhibition called The City We Imagined, The City We Made, Zoom New York 2001 to 2010. I have a few important thank yous to say before we get started. First of all, we're very grateful to our co-sponsor for tonight's program, which is the Continuing Education Program here at Cooper Union. And we're very grateful to the 3 extremely important arts funding agencies that help support this and all League programs. First, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Now, the projection. Okay. I also want to acknowledge the support that the League has received this year from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which we will miss when it's gone. And I want to thank the sponsors of our exhibition, Siami and Cohn Pedersen Fox Associates. The exhibition's on view right now at 250 Hudson Street at Dominic Street in Manhattan through June 26th, and then on July 2nd, it is going to open on Governor's Island for a 7-week run this summer. And it'll be open on Governor's Island on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Please check the League's website, artsleague.org, for open hours for the exhibition and for more information about our upcoming programs with former Deputy Mayor Dan Doctoroff and with current commissioners Vanna Burton, Bernie, and Sadiq Khan. The League created the City Reimagined exhibition as a way of bringing into focus an extraordinary decade in the building of the city, one bookended by the destruction of the World Trade Center and the current stall in development activity due to the economic crisis, with a tremendous outpouring of design proposition and construction activity in between. Not since the Lindsay years has there been so much attention on the part of the city administration to the design of the city or such ambitious plans to restructure it. Tonight we're going to talk with someone who is a critical player in a number of the biggest initiatives of the decade. And I hope we will not only learn some of the backstory that always attends complicated undertakings, but also be able to pick Alex's brain about what kind of strategies worked and what didn't over the last decade, in the interest of making all of us better strategists going forward. A number of you in the audience are or have been involved in some of the projects we'll be talking about, so I encourage you to get your questions ready. We plan to talk for about an hour, and then we'll have a good chunk of time for questions. Alex Garvin is principal of Alex Garvin and Associates, a consulting firm whose work he describes as public realm strategists. He's an adjunct professor of urban planning and management at Yale University, where he has taught continuously, I believe, since 1967. And through his teaching, he's shaped the thinking of multiple generations of urbanists. He's the author of a number of books, including that's his best-known book, The American City, What Works and What Doesn't, and a new book coming out this fall called Public Parks. In 2002 and 2003, Alex was the Vice President for Planning, Design, and Construction at the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, the state city agency formed to supervise rebuilding on the World Trade Center site. From 1996 to 2001, and then again from 2003 to 2005, he was the Managing Director of Planning and Design for NYC 2012, the effort to bring the Olympic Games to New York City. With most introductions, that's about as far back as I would go, but I think it's very useful to know more about Alex's background and the long view he brings to planning and design in New York City. He served as a member of the New York City Planning Commission from 1995 to 2004. Earlier on, from 1978 to 1980, he was Director of Comprehensive Planning for the Planning Commission during the tenure of Bobby Wagner as Chair of the Commission during the Koch administration. From 1974 to 1978, during the Bean years, he was Deputy Commissioner at the New York City Housing and Development Administration, in charge of all New York City housing rehabilitation and preservation programs. And prior to that, from 1970 to 1974, he was Director of Housing and Community Development in the Department of City Planning during the Lindsay administration. He knows New York. Michael Sorkin, who will join me in conversation with Alex, also knows New York. Michael's most recent book, 20 Minutes in Manhattan, is Marcel Proust meets Robert Caro meditation on how the city that Michael sees on his route from home to work each day got to be the way it is. He's principal of the Michael Sorkin Studio, which undertakes design and master planning projects worldwide, and he's director of the graduate program in urban design at the City College School of Architecture. From 1993 to 2000, he was director of the Institute for Urbanism at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And for 10 years, from the 80s into the early 90s, he was the architecture critic for the Village Voice. He's currently a contributing editor at Architectural Record. Okay, so we're going to start with a super quick run through by Alex of the images that you've been looking at to give you a little bit more information about them and to give you a bit of a grounding as a basis for our discussion, and then we'll dive in after that. So, yes.
Can you all hear? First, I'm thrilled by the people in the audience, an extraordinary group of people, some of whom I recognize, but all of you care about this city, as does Michael and Rosalie and I, and I'm thrilled that you're all here. And it makes a great deal of difference to me that you've come. What you've been looking at on the screen are some of the architectural commissions that I was responsible for, and some of my own work planning for Lower Manhattan and for the Olympics in New York. And what I thought I would do is very quickly explain to you what you've been looking at, because about half of the images have never been seen by anybody. They are by some of the most well-known architects in this city and outside. And I will jump in. This is Richard Nattner. This is Columbia University's stadium area. This is a non-existent project by Raffaele Vignoli for an arena in Brooklyn. This was going to be the aquatic center and a public swimming pool operated in the East River, done by Todd Williams and Billy Chen. And this was a plan for the Cultural Olympiad. We were going to have 4 barges that would moor in the East River, on which the world's cultural attractions would be sponsored by each international country. This is Frank Gehry's barge. The next one is by Bob Stern. It was going to have projections on it. You would see a movie of what was going on stage. And we are going to start with the thing that I'm probably most connected with, that is Lower Manhattan. And I picked 3 of the various architects and the speech the mayor made in December of 2002, which laid out a strategy for Lower Manhattan. This is Raffaele Vignoli's plan by a group called Think. He was the lead of the large group. This is Peterson and Littenberg's version, and the one that won was Studio Libeskind with the Freedom Tower. And I wanted to show you the Wedge of Light, which is not a wedge of light. It's a piazza in Lower Manhattan that is a place of dark canyons. We started working on the Olympics for 2008 in the summer of 1996. And this is the first of the plans that we did, completed in February of 97. We looked at a number of places to put a stadium. This is one on the Sunnyside Yards. A number of places for Olympic stadiums. This is by Davis Brody Bond in the East River at 42nd Street. This would continue Battery Park City North by Hugh Hardy, Holzman Pfeiffer. This is one by Cooper Robertson. I think the author is actually in the room, as it happens, Don Clinton. Cooper Robertson's for the Hudson Yards. We went out of business because the United States Olympic Committee decided not to compete for 2008 and came back with a revised plan for 2012, which included a competition for an Olympic Village at Queens West, which was won by the architect of the building we're sitting in, Tom Main. These are some of the things we commissioned at that time. That one was by Diana Balmori for Staten Island. This is by Weiss and Manfredi. This is what we thought the Hudson Yards might be with an Olympic square. There would be a major public open space available to the public. As you will see in a minute, the broadcast tower, a new Madison Square Garden on the right, that was the stadium for the Jets. It's a broadcast tower by Caesar Pelli, a grand new public open space of 8 acres by Harding Olson Pfeiffer, and a very different conception of the Hudson Yards. This was what we found in Williamsburg before it became popular in 1996. Stephen Harris's proposal for this is Peterson and Littenberg's revision of the swimming pool in Astoria. This is where I came in, Richard Dattner, and we can now begin the program.
Okay, could you turn the projector off, please? Turn the projector off. So, Alex, in a period like the last 10 years, it's very difficult to disentangle ideas about how to build a city from the politics that either pave the way for them to happen or prevent them from happening. And tonight, I would like to talk about both the ideas themselves and their fates and the causes thereof. But let's start with the Trade Center side. You were appointed as Director of Planning and Design for LMDC in 2002, and you oversaw the initial massing studies by Linda Bell.
No, that is wrong.
Okay, hold on a second, and let me finish this, and then you can tell me how wrong all of this is. And then you created the innovative design study that produced the 7 high-profile schemes that were seen and debated all over the world, and Studio Leapskin won, and Studio Leapskin's design eventually provided the general guidance for some of the subsequent development of the site. So would you tell us what's wrong about what I just said, but then also what you consider the most important impacts and accomplishments of your work at LMDC, and what are your biggest regrets, and what were the mistakes that you made?
We should spend most of our time on the last two, but I do want to explain. The Port Authority supervised those 6 plans. I was convinced that not only were they inadequate, but they would go down to ignominious defeat, which they did. I'm happy to say the public came out and said, no, that's not good enough.
But they also they were massing studies.
No, the Port Authority undid, I mean, to some degree, the underlying work for them had been done by real architects. What was supposed to be exhibited were a very different set of plans, and the governor's office stopped them. They were to be a plan that had been commissioned by Brookfield, that had been done by Cooper Robertson, a plan that had been commissioned by Larry Silverstein, done by Skidmore and Merrill, 2 plans by Peterson and Littenberg, and 2 plans by Byron, Linder, and Bell. And what came out were 6 massing studies, some of which were somewhat similar to work that other architects had done, that is what the Port Authority thought the public wanted. I did not. I just want to make that clear. You asked me what were my greatest achievements and what do I regret. My greatest achievement, bar none, is that we will have a street at Greenwich Street that runs through from Tribeca to Lower Manhattan. If I did nothing else in my entire career, that one thing is the thing I am proudest of. And I can tell you that nobody believed it was possible. It was done in 3 months' time. And I can't tell you everything that went into it, but that would be my #1 achievement. The #2 achievement is I'm a trained architect. I teach architecture. I believe passionately in having great architecture. And I'm thrilled that that is something that the Architectural League, the AIA, the other institutions that are present all are in favor of. I believe we put on the newspapers, on the front pages of newspapers around the world, that New York cared about architecture, and that we would not give in to just anything. And certainly Bilbao created a different attitude about architecture, and I think we owe Frank Gehry a great thanks for that. But I am very proud, secondly, that when we were doing Lower Manhattan, we were able to say, well, architecture mattered.
You mentioned the Port Authority. Talk a little bit about how you wrested control.
I didn't. Please understand that the property is owned by the Port Authority today. And control in Lower Manhattan is one of the big problems. The MTA is a state agency. West Street is a state highway. Battery Park City is a state corporation. The site of the World Trade Center is owned by the Port Authority, which is half owned by the state of New York. I never had any control over it. The issue was, how do you manipulate through a world in which the state has control? And that was tricky, to say the least. Well, it made even more difficult because we had a second group. We had press that thought that the real player was the victims' families. And so you had stories in the newspapers, as many of you will remember, from September the 12th until early May, that consisted entirely of either the Port Authority, sometimes the person to whom they leased the property, Larry Silverstein, and the victims' families. And the big change came when the public got involved. There was a public hearing at the Pace University in early May in their auditorium. There were 1,700 people there. It was the first time the press ever heard anybody else. They heard from restaurant workers in Chinatown that had lost their jobs, shoemakers that worked in Tribeca, all kinds of other people whose lives had been affected. And I vividly remember leaning over to the deputy mayor, Dan Doctorow, to whom I'm indebted forever for the Olympics and everything else that you've seen on the screen, and said, it's about to change. And it was, I think, the critical moment. And if the public had not stepped in, there was no way of winning that. The site was owned basically by the Port Authority, and they were not interested in any of these things. And so it changed. And of course, the next step was when the 6 plans appeared, and everybody said no. And then there was this event we managed to schedule with 4,500 people at the Javits Convention Center. The first time, and probably the last time in my lifetime, that many people have sat in a room and discussed the future of a city together and disagreed about it, except so many of them agreed with one thing, not those 6 plans. And from that point on, we had a rare moment, maybe 6 months, where we had real public participation. Each of you at various points, I know because I sat in meetings with you, sometimes small meetings, sometimes large meetings. That's what changed everything. Unfortunately, after the Livingston plan was selected, everything went down the drain because people went home, and that was the end of the opposition.
But you know, Alex, to say that it changed everything, it changed many things, but I was at the listening to the city event at the Javits Center, and the one thing in my mind that everybody agreed on, in addition to not liking the city plans, was that nobody in that room wanted 10 million square feet of office space on that site. And so please talk about that a little bit, because that's the program of the site. The 7 architectural teams in the design study never challenged. The Port Authority, there was not 1 inch of budget in that.
This is your document, right?
I don't know.
This is the brief.
Yes.
Which specifically says no housing, 10 million square feet of office space.
That is correct.
How do you feel about that?
Well, let me tell you that you once again missed something. One of the schemes actually proposed housing. One of the schemes proposed moving 2 million square feet off the site. And that was the Livingston's plan. And it's quite interesting. And in fact, what was the problem, and it's an understandable one, and I agree, you have put your finger on something very significant and important. The Port Authority had issued bonds to pay for construction of various things in New Jersey primarily. and they needed cash flow to pay off those bonds. They were relying on the annual rental payment from the Silverstein organization to pay off those bonds. They believed that if the amount of square footage was reduced, the payment would be reduced. And they were not interested in anything except the program as it was, which is why that program was released the way it was. There was no way to get them to agree to reducing the revenue. What was interesting was that we did manage to make a deal with them. And the deal is the Deutsche Bank building. That site actually was bought with our money. The federal government put up $20 billion, which one day some smart journalist is going to follow and find out how it was spent. But of that money, some of it was spent by the LMDC, buying the Deutsche Bank building, which, scandal of scandals, is still standing, I might point out.
It's down to about 20 stories, I noticed today.
Well, still, it's there. And Leibniz can actually propose putting housing on that site. It was an alternative. It wasn't very strong. I'll grant you that.
I think you're having it both ways. If the public was so decisive and had no effect.
No, I think the public, everything is very easy, Michael, you depict it as black and white. I think you're talking about various shades of gray. And what I am saying is that absent the public, you might very well have had those massing studies built and actually carried out.
And you think that the current project is so superior?
No, I certainly think that there are some things in the current plan that are much superior. And the first and most important is the railroad station. Now, I don't particularly like the design, and I think it was intended in the Leibniz plan to open onto that public square that was the wedge of life. And the big change was to reorient the railroad station and the entrances and the exits to Fulton Street. I think that was a big move. The rest, as it turned out, you have two things. It's not just the 10 million square feet of office space, but it's also that you couldn't build on half the site. I mean, look at it this way. The World Trade Center had 10 million square feet. The governor announced that you couldn't build on the footprints, so half the site was removed. So now you're putting the same bulk that was once on 16.5 acres on approximately 8. There's no way you can make a reasonable result out of that. Did I think that was a good idea? No. And until the middle of June to late June, we had schemes that actually redistributed it, created a street network, including Washington Street going through. And my favorite of all the studies that was done by Barbara Littenberg, who figured out a way of reconnecting all the streets and creating the poetic recollection of the Twin Towers by having two public squares, 200 feet square. And on the morning that I read in the New York Times that Governor Pataki announced that this was holy ground, although 300 or more people died on other property that was apparently not holy, and although a railroad was running on it as that happened, and that there's no way that you will ever not build on those sites. And in fact, the current plan, somebody has written about it in the New York Times, but not many, actually is building on edges of it, because otherwise you have to deal with the railroad that runs there. It's not that black and white, is what I'm saying. I think there's shades of gray. Do I think we won everything? No, we did not. Is everything good? No, I do not think so. We did get something.
Yeah, we're going to talk about urban design, whatever that is, later on. And, you know, I worry that in the context of the trade center, we are, as, you know, to quote Sarah Palin, putting lipstick on that 10 million square foot pig. And
it's no longer 10 million square feet, by the way.
Thanks to the market.
Because they moved the 2 million to the Deutsche Bank site.
Yeah.
But still.
But you are saying that there was despite the public hue and cry, despite the many meetings, despite the expenditure of passions, there was the square footage requirement was attractive. That was as sacred a cow as the sacrality of the footprints.
I think that the voters in the state of New Jersey and the state of New York were not willing to buy out Port Authority. And Port Authority owned the site. And nobody in those days was willing to talk about it, just as nobody was willing to confront the different standards. And those two things were intractable, and the result was not very attractive. But maybe we can get on to some other things with the trade centers.
It was great at the moment. I never will look better.
One of the, I can't resist saying this. One of the things that Greg Westman, the curator of our exhibition, found in the massive amount of research that he did for the exhibition is from July of 2001, and it's George Pataki having signed the lease with Silverstein saying, "Mission accomplished." It reminds me of something, I don't know what it is, but something. One of the images that you showed tonight, the first image that you showed was something related to the plan that the mayor presented in December of 2002. And I think for many of us who were paying attention, many of the people in this room probably, that one of the great frustrations of the way that the Trade Center redevelopment has taken place is that very thoughtful, very sensible plan developed by the city didn't seem to actually get as much attention as it should have. And they can focus on transportation linkages and public realm improvements, all of which sounded very sensible. And as I recall it, moving much more than 2 million square feet off of the Trade Center site, it just all made so much sense. So what happened to that plan?
I think, first of all, I think it's an excellent question. Plan came out in December, a week or two before the exhibit of the 9 schemes by the 7 architects, and the world became mesmerized by the competition over those schemes. The exhibition attracted thousands of people, there were websites, and in the aftermath of that, they thought that the real issue was the rebuilding of the Trade Center site. The Port Authority suddenly woke up to the fact that they had to deal with this, and at that point they became serious and started looking at the ones that were buildable out of them. And everybody's focus was on that. And none of the city agencies had been involved in creating that plan. None of them were tied to that plan. And although the mayor had proposed it and put forward the ideas that you could have a bus that went along Fulton Street and circled around it, the boulevard on West Street was Peterson and Littenberg's idea originally. But it's, in case you haven't noticed, the two things about West Street are, one, it's about the same width as the Champs-Élysées. I think it's 10 feet different. The other is that the State Highway Department actually started trying to turn it into something like that boulevard. And I know that Stephen Peterson spent hours working with the bureaucrats there. This was all within reach. And if you also had ferry stops at the two ends, and people in 2002 who had used the ferries after the destruction of the Trade Center had made the subways unusable in Lower Manhattan, were really attracted to the idea. I think it's a great loss, but I cannot explain to you other than that the ownership was not in the hands of the city agencies. Why? And the focus being somewhere else. I think it was doable. I think there are a number of things that were doable, but you needed active support, and it wasn't that
we'll move this a little bit away from the Trade Center, but it's certainly related. And I think was one of them, didn't have any idea how much power the state had over our fate as a city until, you know, one thing after another started coming out with the Trade Center. At the current moment, when we have a humiliatingly dysfunctional state government, do you have any suggestions or recommendations about, do you think it's possible to wrest some of that control away from the state and bring it back to the city over any part of our lives?
I do. I also think that you have to understand how we lost control, because large amounts of that control were given away by the mayor, that is Mayor Lindsay, in the 1960s, in part in order to keep us from having a financial catastrophe. He thought that if he gave away the school system, that the cost would be contained. He thought if he gave away the transit system, the state would cover the cost. And if you start looking at the things that were given away, they ended up costing us a lot, and Mayor Bloomberg, to his credit, has spent most of his administration getting back pieces of that, like the Department of Education. We don't have to give up control. You know, if you take the actions of the state, they don't have to vote on the Hudson Yards or the Atlantic Yards or any of these other things, unless the Empire State Development Corporation is being used to circumvent Bueller. Think about it for a moment. If they weren't involved, then the Authorities Control Board, which consists of 3 people, Speaker Silver, the governor, and the majority leader of the Senate, don't have to vote on it. We don't have to give up control over the city. We've chosen to give up control for the city to the state. Can we take back the transit authority? I don't know. The mayor was successful in getting back education under his control. Did we have to give up the Tribal Bridge and Tunnel Authority? I suspect that Mayor LaGuardia and his prime henchman, Robert Moses, would tell you right now that was the stupidest thing that we could have done, and probably told us at the time. But the ideology of where Moses was coming from reminded us to the reality of what he was saying. So I think, yes, we could, but it requires much more radical thinking than we've had in urban areas, and in New York in particular, in a very long time, although Michael likes to foster some of this, and I often agree with him, actually. Uh-oh. Dangerous, yes, I know. But when I start talking money, you leave from my corner right away.
Where should we go? Can we leap?
We can leave.
Yeah, I'm curious, as a kind of expert in the deployment of planning methodologies and a longtime member of the Planning Commission, what your reaction to the aggregate of the current rezoning is. I was interested to see this NYU study saying that they had analyzed it and there was actually no net increase in the buildable area of the city.
Well, I think probably if you analyze it, it pushes it further with the net decrease, because in fact, what is called contextual makes it much more difficult. You need more land now, you need to provide parking for it. I mean, there are a whole lot of things that make it more expensive to build. I think the focus we've had in the United States for at least half a century has been wrong. We're focusing on private property. I don't think we should be focusing on private property. I think we should be talking about what we all own in common, the streets and the parks. And you know, the 1916 zoning ordinance was drafted to create certain kinds of streets. The height limits were related to the width of streets. The height limits, therefore, and the width of streets allowed the sun to come down. The amount of traffic was related to that. And I think that we continue to make a big mistake, and fundamental error was repealing the 1916 ordinance. Another thing is land use. In 1961, we shifted from a situation where half the city was zoned for unlimited use. Today we would call it mixed use. It's much more fashionable. But that allowed the ebb and flow of occupancy in buildings. 61 froze everything. So I also think that the zoning ordinance is totally out of kilter. Why should we have 1,000 pages that nobody can understand? Why should it take so long to figure out what to do? And why should we do an environmental impact study to change the zoning for 3 units of housing that can't be afforded by anybody?
But it's clear that the political culture has shifted very much in favor of private interests in recent years. You know, we often are hearing about public-private partnerships, which seem to be a kind of another description of using public energies and powers to engorge development, abuse of condemnation, in the Atlantic Yards, the Columbia project. All this seems abusive to me. So how would you go about rejiggering? I mean, since you've just said that this fixation on property is problematic, how would you go about redressing this imbalance in a culture that thinks that private capital is all wise?
Well, I'm not against private capital, as you know, Michael. I am pro-development. I believe very much in that.
I would read Kropotkin about 3 minutes ago.
No, I'm talking about what we all own. And I think it's high time we spend our energy and our money on what we own. We own streets, we own water supply, we own parks. Now, if you look at, you raise the Atlantic Yards, what kind of public realm is there? None. It's a single site that's been rezoned for a single owner with a set of towers in it and an arena. That's not a public realm. I would ask that if you are going to increase what you can support on the site in terms of many thousands of additional apartments, that you need to be able to support them with something, such as community facilities, mass transit, and streets. And I have a problem when the upzoning isn't related to that. The Hudson Yards, on the other hand, assuming that the subway actually goes in there, is a totally different animal, because there you have a situation where you might actually be able to carry it. If the public realm had been something, if you looked at the Hudson Yards in the version that the Olympics paid for, it was an 8-acre park, surrounded by very high-density development, I might add, which was going to help pay for it.
But why has Atlantic Yards gone so bad with such a constellation of enlightened officials in power?
I will let you answer that question. I won't. I think that the Atlantic Yards could be great. I don't think it is. I think I had an interesting walk at, looking at Columbia's redevelopment plan a few weeks ago, and I was quite struck. There are maybe 3 or 4 properties that are fighting Columbia because they don't want to be taken. I'm both a designer, a developer, both, and a planner. And I looked at this site and I said, if you don't take those properties, what earthly difference does it make to that plan? They've got streets and blocks. Leave them alone. Why are they doing this? It isn't a very innovative plan. It adds a street, which is good, and is a location. But ask yourself this question: how do you make a redevelopment plan that ignores entirely anything that in the block between the Hudson River Park and the next street, where you have Fairway and you have a whole lot of other buildings? Now, is there supposed to be no connection to the waterfront? I would argue that what we're not doing is paying attention to what is the public realm for the public and buying that.
But I find it extremely perplexing that the public is willing to use its greatest power, which is to seize property, without insisting on this public benefit use. I mean, why isn't it happening? I'm baffled, given the many people who are talking the talk in the city government these days.
Well, you have to ask them. I'm afraid I cannot answer. I would obviously do it differently. And I think it's possible to do differently. I think you can also do it cost-effectively differently. By the way, I'm not against what you are, which is some of the privatization of the public realm. I think there isn't a person in this room who thinks that Bryant Park isn't a public park, and yet it's entirely financed by an entity that raises money from other than the public. It's also run magnificently well, but it's not run by the Parks Department. There's a $9 billion budget at the moment. It had a $250,000 budget in 1960. There's an example of a way that you can do this without giving up the public's control or use of the public realm.
But I think the argument is that there are, in fact, multiple publics, and some publics are able to benefit more greatly from these arrangements than others.
Depending on which one, I agree with you. But, you know, I think the best example of dealing with the public realm that has happened in the last 18 months is what the Commission of Transportation has managed to do, reclaiming the public realm for the public and away from motor vehicles.
Totally.
Whether that's Times Square or Broadway, it's amazing. And it's being done with money from the government. And it's our property, and it's being used, I think, in a much more intelligent way. The bicycle paths that are being created are part of the same thing. It's possible to do that. And there are agencies in the city government, like that one, that's doing it. The Parks Department is another one that I think is doing a remarkable job fixing up existing parks in poor neighborhoods and taking care of them. Not all of them. They don't have it into the budget. So, again, it's not black and white. There are good things and bad things. There are things that are well done and things that are not.
Given that the culture seems to be one of trade-offs, maybe you could speak a little bit about the history of the bonus system, which is something I think you were involved with in the Lindsay days, in the urban design group, no?
I was never in the urban design group, actually, but I was involved in the Lindsay administration, and I did draft one piece of zoning that provided a bonus. And that was in suburban areas where you were building a subdivision of greater than an acre and a half, you got bonuses in exchange for putting in school space and other community facilities. Because I thought there ought to be a relationship there. I don't think anybody has used it since it passed the then Board of Estimates in 1973. But there were, it was, I thought, going to work. It did. I think that I'm much more in favor of as of right, frankly. I think we should decide what it is we, as the public, would like. We ought to print it in the zoning ordinance, and people who wish to build ought to be able to look it up easily, not on 1,000 pages, but 1 or 2, and figure out what they can do and go to an architect or a lawyer and then file plans to the buildings department. And we should not be dealing in this crazy quilt of bonuses and benefits and all the rest of them.
Do you think the inclusionary zoning bonus is going to yield any truly constructive results? I'm quite curious to hear your brief history of the series of bonus strategies since the 60s.
But I don't favor bonuses, plain and simple. I think if we want to provide subsidized housing, and we have 170,000 units in the city of public housing, that we should be subsidizing housing. I'm a great proponent of public housing. I think the Housing Authority does a remarkable job. I don't think that anybody in this room, unlike most of the rest of the country, would be in favor of tearing down any of those buildings. And yet, if you go to Atlanta, San Francisco, any major city in the United States, they're tearing down housing the poor people live in because it's badly run. It's a, well, anyway.
But they have been threatened behind Lincoln Center, Chelsea. There are forces that wish to make this go away.
Well, I'm not one of them. I happen to be in favor of that. And my view is that if we want to provide housing for people who cannot afford what the market can provide, we should subsidize it. And I have no problem with appropriating money for that. Now,
How do we get you back on the
well,
commission?
the other part of it I might add is that we've got to increase the supply because if we don't have a city in which ordinary people can afford to live, we're going to lose out. I mean, the reason that people come to New York is they want to go into advertising, they want to go into the theater, they want to go into fashion, they want to go into architecture, and they think that this is the center of these worlds in the United States. If they can't afford to live here, we're not going to be that center, and that means finding ways to increase the amount of housing that ordinary people can afford. So it's not just the very poor that you have to worry about, but you have to worry about all of them.
Well, there's another question. Those are certainly worlds for which we are world famous.
It used to be.
I wonder whether the kind of set of worlds that you envision as making up a satisfactory. Nobody comes here to be a stevedore or an ironman.
They used to. Well,
Indeed, but I wonder as all of those worlds slip away, as we deindustrialize, as we focus more and more narrowly, what's becoming of the city, and what we should do in order to re-expand our galaxy of opportunities.
well, I also don't think that the city is dying. We are a growing city at this point. We have, thanks to immigration, a growing population. We have all kinds of small businesses all over the city, not just Korean trading companies on 32nd Street, but if you look at the metalworking small shops in Queens or the suppliers of leather goods, but it's small people. And we have been focusing too much, I think, on large corporations. The large companies like Alcoa are not about to establish smelting companies in New York City. Aside from which, you can't put a sanitation garage in a neighborhood. You certainly can't put a smelting operation that gets bauxite from abroad. I think we need to think in much easier. For example, we have a definition of what is a multiple dwelling in New York. It's 2 units or less. And those are the only buildings in New York that do not need a fire escape as secondary means of egress. And yet, if you go to Queens and some parts of Brooklyn, you will see 3-family houses all over the place, many of them illegal, because the garage has been converted into an apartment for a mother-in-law or something like that. Why not change that law? Change the multiple dwelling law. We, by the way, you cannot occupy an apartment as 5 unrelated individuals. That's against the law. And yet, we know that students do this all over the city, as do many immigrants. So why aren't we looking at our occupancy rules? And if it's so complicated to figure out the zoning, why not just make it simple and say if you build a small building, you can go, you don't need to go through the trouble that the large developer that's doing the Atlantic Yards has to. I grant you that an environmental impact statement on the Atlantic Yards is a desirable thing to do. But if you're changing the zoning for the block front on 72nd Street and West End Avenue, why? You don't need that. We have antiquated laws that nobody has looked at for years, and we add more and more things to them. So, but I would do heaven and earth to increase the amount of housing so that we can free up apartments for people who'd like to live here.
Okay, let's jump to the whole other subject, which is the Olympics. You don't really strike me as a person who runs around on Sundays with a hockey stick or glued to the football game on TV. So how'd you get involved in the Olympics, and why were you willing to use sports?
I'll tell you the whole story, but there are a number of people that know me well who know that I do not go to sporting events, and that and Dan Doctoroff always used to be petrified that I tell some newspaper reporter that I go to the opera or to chamber music or to the theater, and I don't attend sporting events. I got involved in the Olympics by sheer accident. The American City came out. Dan Doctoroff had an idea that we ought to have the Olympics in New York. He was in Barnes & Noble, he found the book, he bought it, and he called me into his office. This was February of 1996. And I had no idea who he was. He was a merchant banker in an office on 55th Street. I didn't know why he called me in. And he asked me, what do you think of the idea of having the Olympics in New York? And I said, it's a great idea. Again, many of you know me well. For me to say yes positively rather than no and ask questions later, unlikely. I said yes immediately. He said, well, why do you think that? And I said, well, why would you turn down $5 billion? Now, I didn't know that Atlanta, which was about to have the Olympics, was projecting total spending in Atlanta to be $5 billion. But I knew it was a lot of money. And I knew that was jobs for hotel workers and restaurant workers and bus drivers and all kinds of people who needed work in New York. Aside from which, I thought we could use the opportunity to create things we might not have. And then he turned to me and said, can we run the Olympics? And I said, sure. And he said, well, how would you do it? He said, I haven't a clue. And there began my relationship with an extraordinary man that I hope you'll all come and hear in July when he is interviewed. And I brought in two of my teaching assistants from Yale, J.B. Clancy and Chris Glachik, and we spent 6 months looking at every vacant site in New York that we could find. I point out vacant because I don't believe in relocation. I may be far to the right of Michael, but I'm also a creature of the world of urban renewal. And I don't see why we have to displace people unnecessarily. We found about 300 large vacant sites. We also studied every possible type of facility. There were 36 different venues for the Olympics. They all had different requirements. And I was determined we were going to put as many of them as we could in New York because that meant that my fellow citizens would benefit from them. And I even, there is a photograph of me in a canoe going down the Bronx River because I was under the delusion that whitewater kayaking and canoeing could be done in city waterways. It turned out I was wrong. I also went on the site to see what the Bronx River was like. We went everywhere, in every borough, and it was surprising. And we knew everything about these facilities, we thought, until we had to deal later on with the U.S. Olympic Committee and then the International Olympic Committee. And I can tell you how it happened and how the Olympic X occurred. One day, it was a Tuesday, I teach at Yale on Tuesdays, and I came in and Dan, ferocious, why don't we have a plan? It's February, he's paying a lot of money out of his pocket to do this. And I said to my colleagues, I'm locking the door, and I'm leaving for New Haven on the 12:07 train. And by the time we're done, we will have a plan for the Olympics. And they thought I was crazy. I said, listen, we know more about the city and the requirements than anybody ever has before. We ought to be able to figure it out. So I turned to my colleagues and said, how would you run the Olympics? And we had looked at a lot of things. And they said, Water Olympics. The idea being ferry boats, which we ultimately use. I looked at it and said, it doesn't work. there are too many sites that are not on the river. And I looked at them and said, but I know how to make it work. And I literally put yellow tracing tape on a map of the city and traced over it the Long Island Railroad going to Penn Station and out to New Jersey. And that's how the plan happened. I left for New Haven. Half an hour later, Van Doctoroff came in. He looked at it, he turned to JB and said, what's that? And I don't know whether it was Chris or JB who answered him, but they said, that's Alex's notion of the Olympics. And he looked at it and said, the Olympic X. And they said, yes. And the idea was that everything on that X was accessible by subway except for Staten Island. Because every day, 500,000 people had to be able to get to the competition sites. And every single competition site would be accessible to the athletes, either on the ferry or on the rail line. And they wouldn't have to go into New York City traffic. And I had heard from my fellow citizens week in, week out, oh, you're not serious about the Olympics in New York, think of the traffic. That's how the Olympic X happened. We had located on, and we had alternative sites as well, all the competition sites and all of the practice facilities. And then we started to figure out where should we put the too expensive ones. We didn't have enough money because we had commissioned a study so that we would know what the operating costs would be and what the revenues would come in from ticket sales, television rights, sponsorships. There was a net operating income of $1.2 billion, and that became the budget, of which some $300 million was contingency, $900 we had to pay for it, and we had two things we couldn't afford, the Olympic Village and the Olympic Stadium, which is why you saw up there various sites which we were looking at, some of which were financially feasible, like Battery Park City North, politically completely infeasible, because the building in the Hudson River would never have gotten through at that point. Some of them were the opposite, politically feasible, and I think Don Clinton's drawing, I think it's yours, of the putting the Olympic Village on the Hudson Yards was certainly marketable at that point, but it was politically infeasible. Also, we had no way of paying for the platform all at once. And unless the developers were willing to put up the housing and run it afterwards, we had no way to pay for the village. And then in the middle of all of this, with some rather interesting schemes that we had, the U.S. Olympic Committee said, we're not going for 2008. It's going to be run by Beijing. And we're going to go for 2012. When we became sure that Beijing was going to win in 1999, Dan called me again and said, let's start all over again. At which point, and we have one of my colleagues who worked on it here in the audience, we started all over again. And we had to do Josh Jenkins, suddenly we had to deal with the U.S. Olympic Committee and then the International Olympic Committee and so on. And one of the things that I thought was important was that we get public buy-in. I had just come out of Lower Manhattan, and I convinced Dan that we should run a competition for the Olympic Village. And Morphosis' plan, which you saw, is what came out of it. And I am very disappointed that Queens West is never going to look anything like that. We're not going to have a public realm like that. We're not going to have the environmental things that were part of that plan.
So the concept that emerged was a disaggregated Olympics.
Yes and no. Disaggregated, you're right, in the sense that all over the New York metropolitan area, you would have different facilities, but they were all accessible by subway.
But do you think the fact that it did not present a kind of critical mass in one place was decisive in losing the bid?
No, it had nothing to do with the bid. It had entirely to do with the internal politics of 120 to 125 members of the International Olympic Committee. It had nothing to do with our plan, nothing to do with the stadium. And if we had understood that, I think we would have handled our bid differently. We had two events that occurred that might have helped or hurt what we did. The first is that on the 12th of September 2001, we would have won the Olympics. The world wanted to help New York. And after George Bush attacked Iraq, most of the members of the IOC were certainly not well disposed to the United States. And I don't think that's why we fully lost either, but it certainly made it almost impossible. The rest would be internal machinations of countries that would.
A last question about the Olympics. In your urbanist heart of hearts, you think that was a good place for a gigantic football stadium?
Well, in the world of reality, Michael, you have to pay for things. And if the Jets wouldn't agree to pay for it anywhere else, we wouldn't have it. And if we didn't have the stadium, we couldn't have the Olympics. I certainly would have liked to have it. You saw up there, and not by accident, a site on the Sunnyside Yards, accessible by 7 subway lines and 1 railroad. But the Jets didn't want to go there. And in the real world, it isn't just, is this a desirable thing?
So the Jets are playing the Port Authority role in the drama?
No. The Port Authority's role in the drama was very different and not nice. The Jets had a business. They didn't have to come to New York. They had a lease that was expiring in New Jersey in 2008, and they agreed to come and play in the game. And they spent a lot of money on it. That's very different from the Port Authority that did its utmost best to undo everything we tried to do. For example, when I came back to work on the Olympics in 2003, the stadium was about 15 to 20 feet higher. It had a whole level in there for field hockey and ice hockey and an arena. And if that had been built, then we could never have managed the opening procession for the Olympics because you had to go off a ramp, and we could never make it. And I actually was able to go into the Jets and say, you're going to have to take out an entire level and win. The Port Authority had the power, it had the money, and there was no negotiation. It's a very different thing. In a perfect world, I don't believe you have perfect worlds, so I can't answer the question the way you would like to.
Urban design was invented sometime in 1956 at a conference at the GSD, presided over by Jose Sorkin, my conspiracy theory. But I think as a discipline, it's becoming very innovative, frankly, and that now it's us who need to kind of reacquire from the planners all sorts of principles and methods that seem to be missing from a rather impoverished vocabulary of urban design. If it's reduced to simply a set of conventions for good behavior on block frontages, then it's lost its interest and relevance. I think architects can do that. So I mean, but again, I'm somebody who has some difficulty with the disciplinary boundaries in general. Architecture planning, urban design, landscape, environmental planning. It seems to me that what's needed conceptually is to obliterate the boundaries at this point. A grand reunification of the disciplines, which are getting sectarian. And one of the symptoms of the anxiety is that all these hybrid disciplines that are beginning to emerge, landscape, urbanism, whatever that is. As if we hadn't gone through enough schismatic behavior already, and somehow the urban design is, I think, the way it's conventionally practiced, losing sight of the real planetary issues that have to shape thinking about cities. I think both Alex and I are interested in recapturing some of that territory.
It's interesting. If you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have told you there is no such thing as urban design. I would have told you that architects are under the misapprehension that large-scale architecture is urban design, or that exterior decoration is urban design. And then I had to work for more of that. And I learned really from Stephen Peterson and Barbara Wittenberg that there was actually discipline there. And so I would like to try to tell you what I think urban design is about, and it's about the public realm. It is not about what a building looks like. The greatest, the best designed city, in my judgment, in the world is Paris. Most of the architecture in Paris is lackluster. It's not particularly good. There are some great buildings there. But basically, Paris is a wonderful place because of the boulevards, because of the places the public occupies. And
every boulevard, I dare say, is.
Well, but if you look at the laws that they put into place in the 18th century and continued into the 19th century, they have exact height limits that are related to the width of streets. They have lines that determine what the angle of the sun is that's going to come in there. And interestingly enough,
the same in the Ceausescu days in Bucharest, when they couldn't produce Paris.
Well, but the difference is that if you look at what happened in Paris, nothing is symmetrical. Nothing is in fact axial, and that is because they ran into the problems of real buildings and real functions in opposition. And if you look at the Grand Boulevard, which continue on around the corner and around the next corner, it's a fascinating kind of place. That is a well designed city from an urbanistic point of view. And I think that we have lost our interest in how you design that public realm. And there are designers who do this, and there are designers also who have the right words about it, but when you look at what they have done, they haven't. The New Urbanists would be an example. I'm a great admirer of Andres Guani and Elizabeth Platter-Zeinberg. I think their work is extraordinary. Their followers leave me rather cold. But having said that, their rhetoric is all about this. Then look at Seaside, which is a set of charming little houses with picket fences and pitched roofs and front porches. That's not a public realm. The de-emphasis on the automobile, which is one of the hallmarks of that, is not the case because the cars are all parked on the street there on the crushed shells. And in their later work, such as when you go on to back alleys, it means that the street has none of the life that comes from the people getting in and getting out of automobiles and trucks doing the delivery and so on. I think there is such a thing. I don't think we know very much about it. I agree with Michael that we need to have the association of all those skills, and that's very difficult. But then I'm a planner fundamentally, and I think of the world in terms of tying together landscape and finance and politics and design, and I think that's very important. I agree with Michael that the planning profession has left a great deal to be desired in doing that. But I would argue that many of the architects have from the other point of view as well.
Amen.
Get ready with your questions. I'm just going to make one last comment while you're getting your questions ready, which is that it's very interesting to us in putting together the exhibition that the projects that rose to the top in a way as the what I think probably will be the great legacy of this decade are the parks being created in New York. Fresh Kills, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Governor's Island, the High Line, the Bronx River Parkway. I mean, parks all over the place that really fundamentally change the experience of being in the city on a daily basis, I think, for lots of people. So it's interesting to me. Landscape hasn't come up much, except for Michael saying that all the disciplines need to work together, and what about this landscape urbanism and such. What do you think about parks. Your new book is actually about public.
First, I'm going to put in a plug. The name of the book is Public Parks, the Key to Livable Communities, and it covers everything you could possibly want to know about parks from their inception until management, finance, design, public participation, literally everything from the 19th century to the present. There are 300 color pictures. By all means, go onto the web and look for it. It will be out in the fall. Having said that, New York has always been the leader in parks. We used to be the leader in housing, I might add, in subsidized housing as well. And in a lot of other things. The parks is the last of these areas where we have really maintained the cutting edge. It's not just Bryant Park or the High Line, which are glowing, visible things. I think the Hudson River Park is the single most important thing we've done. New York City today has 26% of its territory devoted to parkland. That is #1 in the country, running away. And we're adding all the time, whether it's the Brooklyn Bridge Park, or it's Fresh Kills in Staten Island, or it's the development of sections around Jamaica Bay, such as Perigat Basin, that are being devised. It is amazing what's going on. It's the community gardens on the Lower East Side and other parts of poor neighborhoods in New York. It is an amazing thing that we have done. And there's another city that has the same sort of dedication to parks as a planning device, and that's Minneapolis, which has an even better park system, but not as much land devoted to it. I think it's absolutely central, and it gets back to my point. We should be looking at the public realm and stop telling other people what to do with their property, except where that property impinges badly on the public realm. We really don't want to have a lot of traffic where you can't carry it on the roads. You also want to have the most people where you can support them with a transit system. That doesn't take rocket scientists, anybody in the room will tell you that. Go look at our zoning ordinance and tell me that there's some relationship between the location of our extraordinary subway system and the amount you can build it around each one of those subway stations.